Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 82, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I'm feeling a bit like an imposter this week because literally the only thing I sewed last week was to hem a shower curtain. We have a rental house that is on the property next door to our primary residence, and our tenants moved out last week, and we're trying to get it ready for family members to be able to stay over there. And I bought a shower curtain, and it was about 3 inches too long, so I hacked off 3 inches from the bottom and hemmed it. And that has been the sum total of my sewing. I've had a few other things going on unrelated to sewing, but they're over now, and I'm hoping to get back to working on that Bernina University jacket. I need to get it finished because that's going to be here before we know it at the rate things are going. Last week brought more upheaval in the sewing universe. You've probably seen that Michaels acquired Joann Fabric's intellectual property in the form of some of their brands. It looks like they'll be producing Big Twist yarns. And I'm not even going to try to explain what's happening with some of this stuff because it changes from day to day. So I will put the latest links that I can find to this information in the show notes. If you want to do some further research, you can start there. The second thing that happened was that the parent company of the Big Four brands, Big Four sewing pattern brands, Simplicity, Butterick, McCall's, and Vogue, their parent company was sold to a liquidator. And again, I don't know how to interpret that. I'm going to put some links to information that I found. Some people are saying nothing's going to change. Simplicity, the simplicity.com website appears to have a statement saying it's business as usual. So I guess we'll have to wait and see where we go from here. Today's interview is a little bit lengthy, so I'm just going to jump right in. One of my podcast listeners suggested that I interview Daryl Lancaster, who is a hand weaver and teacher, and she specializes in sewing with hand-woven fabric. Her journey is absolutely fascinating, and even if you never sew with hand-woven fabric, I think that if you do any sewing at all, you will find this to be very entertaining and informative. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in. Daryl, welcome to the podcast. I am so thrilled to have you.
Janet, thank you for asking me. This is such a treat.
One of my listeners suggested that I interview you, so I hope that she is out there listening.
I hope so too. Hello, whoever you are who knew me.
So let's start. I usually start by asking people how they learned to sew, how old they were, who taught them.
So my mother, who is still alive at 94, God bless her, she was the quintessential 1950s housewife. She raised 3 daughters. She was a perfect helpmate to my father. You know, house was always spotless. The meals were always on the table, and she sewed everything. And she was also a tailor. By skill, not by trade, because a quintessential housewife does not work. She decided when I was 10 years old, I was fascinated. And up to that point, I was, fooling around with the sewing machine, making little Barbie doll clothes as best I could. But she introduced me at 10 years old. She took my 8-year-old sister and me, and I will never forget this. This was one of the highlights of my life, to the JCPenney fabric section of the JCPenney store at the EJ Corvettes Mall, the Audubon Shopping Center, where they had soft Philadelphia pretzels, 3 for 25 cents. It was like one of these embedded childhood things. And I walked into that fabric store and I got to sit and look through all the pattern books and come up with what I wanted to make, and then pick fabric to go with it. And to me, that was the most empowering, creative thing you could ever imagine. But it was, to me, it transformed my entire childhood. And I jumped into it with absolute madness. The first thing my mom taught me was how to take the sewing machine apart and put it back together and how to oil it. So good routine maintenance. And then she taught me what to do when I sewed over my finger, which would inevitably happen. And I think I've probably done it maybe in my entire career of more than 60 years, probably maybe 8 times, 10 times. That what not to do, yank your finger so the needle breaks off. I mean, that was embedded from me early on. And when I would teach 4-H groups and things, I always started with that, which made all these really crazy boys really respectful of this machine. Anyway, so I jumped into it, and she had gotten a position, much to my father's unhappiness, teaching adults tailoring at night school. And so by this point, I was pretty well versed with the machine, and she did those little purple mimeographed handouts and how to make bound buttonholes and how to do pad stitching on collars. And she would try them out on me. So she figured if my 12 or 13-year-old daughter could figure it out, she had a spitting chance with the adults. So by the time I was 15, I was tailoring, and I had started a small alterations business in my town, which if you want to learn how to really sew and alter things and fit people, be a person who does alterations, because I was this skinny, scrawny teenager. I had no body, and so having to learn to fit people. And she was always in the kitchen cooking. Sidebar: I never learned to cook. I can now, but that was not in what she taught me. She taught me to sew, and she would come in and she would check with her little Dritz ruler, the dreaded Dritz ruler seam gauge. No, this seam allowance is not 5/8. Rip it out and do it again. And I wanted perfection. I did. I tried that on my daughter, who went, "Mom, it's good enough. Go away." But, there was a passion that I instantly was drawn to. I loved the creativity in it. And then it became time to go to college. So I should also say that I went to a parochial school for 8 years where we wore a very restricted plaid uniform. So I had no creative wardrobe until I went to a public high school, where I went crazy. I mean, some of the things I made were by today's standards, by today's standards, pretty tame. I mean, when I look at how my daughter dresses, but at the time, it was like newfound creativity. I could wear what I wanted. And I signed up for all the art classes, which of course I did not have in parochial school. And I loved it. And so when it was time to go to college, I wanted to major in art. I mean, my mom was like, "Well, home economics, because you're going to be a housewife." And I'm like, "No, I'm not." And she said, "Yes, you are. You get this, right?" So I went to art school, and my father kept saying, "Well, go into business, women in business. Oh, this is like, we're hiring women all the time." And I'm like, "No, I just want to be an art major." I applied to one school and I had to stay in state. And if you know the geography of New Jersey, even though we have 9 million people living in it, it's the size of a peanut. Literally, it's shaped like a peanut and it's sized like a peanut. And I went as far north as I could to get away from home, because you do that at that age. And that was 2 hours north to Montclair State University. It's the only place I applied to. They had a very well-respected art department. It was right outside New York City. So that's where I landed and thrived. And when I found the textile department, they had looms, they had spinning wheels, they spoke my language. It was great. And so I have a degree in fine arts. So my degree is a BA in fine arts. And of course I had to take painting and ceramics and drawing and, all the things that go with that, which all helped my career. But I learned to weave, and I learned how to spin, and I learned how to do surface design and silk screening and crochet and card weaving and all the different tasks that one needs. And of course, I was told when I went to college, in no uncertain terms, don't come home unless you have a husband, because that's the best place to meet them. All that grooming for, I did meet a guy, and it turned out, wait, it's great to the story. It turned out his mother, when I started dating him, I found out, was a master spinner and bobbin lace maker. So of course, I had to date him 6 months before he would let me meet his mother.
Oh my.
And then he said to me, "Bring that stuff that you're spinning, because then you can impress her." So I brought my skeins of hand spun yarn, and I will never forget the look on her face. And I showed her, I was all excited, and she kind of looked down at her glasses at me and she said, Well, that's a good start. And I was like, oh. So anyway, many years later, I was with her when she died at 90. She was my lifelong fiber friend. And of course, I still have my mom. And it, it was that support that I had. And I will say that a lot of my professional business, even though I worked incredibly hard for it, for every minute of it, I had the support of a guy with a steady income and benefits. And that allowed the flexibility for me to say yes to things that maybe didn't necessarily pay well or that might lead to other things, that I had flexibility in the arts. And when there was a retrospective of my body of work at the local community college last year, I had 90 pieces in it. And I stood back and I looked at this huge body of work and I cried, because few people ever get to see that in one space like that. And I wished that my husband, who had passed away actually 9 years next weekend, could have been there, because even though I did all this myself, he really was the support behind it. So anyway, it was a wild journey. And I started out doing, because what do you do with an arts degree in the 70s? But craft fairs were big. And so I started actually weaving as a production weaver for a couple of women who were designing yardage, mohair yardage. And it was great, because that's where you learn to produce fast and efficiently and accurately, and you become a machine. And then I eventually, after a couple of years of that, started doing craft fairs on my own, which, learning how to fit people on the fly and learning how to run a business. It was all new. I didn't get that business degree like my father suggested, because, I didn't want to be in business.
It's a great story. What was the first garment you made from your hand woven fabric?
So this is kind of funny. Well, there were two milestones here. In college, on my fourth year of textiles, you always had to do a final project. And I had done, and my degree was in fine arts, so it was kind of conceptual, especially in the 70s. There was no talk of practical things, what you're going to actually do with this degree, because it was assumed you're going to go to a gallery and sell your famous artwork. Yeah. But I remember for my final project, there in the weaving community, I don't know if you've come across this term. There's something called a bog jacket, BOG, and it's based on a shape of rectangles put together on this garment that was found in a bog and preserved in a bog in the Bronze Age, which was a long time ago. But the shape of it, which is basically if you put your arms out in a T and you kind of, the top of it goes over, long sleeve, and then under the arms, the pieces come around and connect in the front. So it's kind of like an overshirt tunic, but it's all rectangles. It's very popular, or at least was in the early days of the hand weavers, because you didn't have to cut the fabric. I knew how to cut fabric, but this was a classic shape, the bog jacket. Ask any weaver and they'll nod knowingly, Anyway, so for my fourth semester final project, I made a bog jacket. And I will tell you, I'm still proud of it, because I attempted clothing, but it did not go over well, because it was functional. It was practical. And, that's not what my degree was really focused on. But I was undaunted, because I was weaving cloth. Cloth meant something to cut into garments. So when I started working for the production people, we were doing mohair yardage, and then they found out I could sew. So they started giving me some of the yardage that I wove to cut into garments. And I would, try to stick with the rectangle, so there wasn't a lot of intense finishing, and, some of it was very loosely woven. So it was a little fragile. So I tried to pick finishes and things based. The problem was that I was a tailor. It was an incongruity to, that's not probably a correct word, but incongruousness, to being a tailor and working this fabric that I had woven, and how to put those two together, which I eventually figured out. But back then, so I started making, if you can imagine this, mohair running suits. And so I did a number of garments for them, but it was for them. It wasn't really where I let my skills be unleashed. And then when I started doing craft fairs, I was almost terrified of doing clothing because my early attempts were way overworked. I mean, I'm tailoring stuff that really didn't need to be tailored. And so I started out with household textiles because that's easy and you don't have to size it. You just have to match people's false craft dishes. Remember the false craft
Oh,
dishes in the
yes.
early 80s? Right. So I looked them all up in the Sears catalog and I picked colors that would go with people's false craft dishes. But anyway, I I had done a commission for somebody through this designer of this mohair fabric for, so this is a really funny story, for a set of uh, curtains that were lacy. And they asked me if I could do this technique, and I could. And could I make these panels for this client's windows? So I agreed, and they started out with a header at the top and the bottom in plain weave, just basic over under before it got into the lacy part. And when I finished the commission, one of the panels was 1 inch too short. So this was kind of like one of those, oh my God, either my career is over or I fix this. And the only way to fix it was to get more of the yarn and reweave the entire commission, which, so on my expense, I did, because, I am, if nothing else, my father's daughter, and my integrity has always preceded me. And I had to, make the client satisfied and the person I was doing this for, my boss, happy as well. So anyway, I did. So now that left me with 4 panels, one that was too short and 3 that were, for my own use, which didn't fit any of my windows. But here's what happened. So someone, and no one will own up to this at this point, no one even remembers this, but someone of my friends or family said to me, why don't you cut a hole in the neck and stick a belt around it and make a tunic out of them? And I thought, oh. And they said, because, people they can only buy so many throws and placemats and things for their house, but they will buy clothing over and over again. It was one of the things that, as a business person, it never occurred to me, but duh. And so I did that. And my first whole body of work in craft fairs that had to do with clothing was exactly that. I would weave these lengths of panels, fringed at the bottom. It was very 70s and going into the 80s. And then I just cut a hole in the neck and stitch it really well and crochet around it, crochet up the sides and wind a belt in it. And I sold those multiple times. And I was sort of stunned. There was a need for women to want to look different, but they were going back into the workplace and they still needed to look a little more corporate than a craft fair refugee, if I could say it without insulting anybody. But, the craft fairs produced, especially in clothing back then, stuff that you wouldn't really wear. I mean, I live in North Jersey. This is corporate America here. So it was really trying to balance a line between what the customer might want and what I was willing to weave 30 yards of in a sitting. And I eventually figured that out, and I was pretty successful, to the point where after 10 years, I wanted to never weave again. I mean, it was grueling. I did some 18 craft fairs a year, and I produced just yards and yards and yards of hand-woven fabric, mostly in plain weave. I just mixed all kinds of yarns together because if I couldn't get something, I could substitute something else and nobody would know the difference. But I ran a business. I ran a successful business until I just couldn't do it anymore. But by then I was starting to get asked to teach. And when you teach, this well, it's a whole different skill set. And the people who would say to me, oh, I wish I could afford your work, I wish I could have something, I could now empower them to do it themselves. That was really big for me. Instead of making things for a very small segment of the population, I could take anybody who wanted to learn and I could make them make something from their own hands. That was a huge turning point. And then in there, I had a couple of babies unexpectedly in my 30s. I had to learn to be able to travel to teach, with these kids and be able to leave them. And that was a challenge. But I developed a way to teach what I did in a streamlined fashion. I developed my own line of patterns, which I still sell in my e-shop, that worked well for hand wovens. They were simple in style and cut, but the directions were extensive, because I mean, cloth is cloth, whether it's commercial or hand woven, and patterns are patterns. Fit is really the most important issue, but how you handle a hand woven, of course, requires a little bit. I often liken it to having a child with ADD. The most creative kind of child you will ever want to have, and they are amazing, but you kind of have to keep a leash on them.
Were your students already hand weavers?
So when I would travel the country, I would say 98% of them were already hand weavers, and many of them, because of the demographic and the hand weaving community, tend to, at least at the time, I mean over the last 20 years, tended to be older, because hand weaving requires a huge commitment of time and money, and it's hard for people with young families, young careers, to embark on that. But usually the demographic that I taught to had home ec back in the day. And so they had an overview, or maybe sewed their own clothes, but life got in the way, or, had that home ec experience. And I say this jokingly, but I'm dead serious. Some of them were still in therapy from that 8th grade apron experience, which, did a number on a lot of people's heads. But here are their hand weavers. You can have just so many scarves and placemats and dish towels, and they want to be able to wear what they weave, especially when you go to a hand weaving conference. The activity in an elevator when people are pawing all over what you made and going, oh, how many shafts did you do? What was the pattern you used? It's really hysterical, especially if you're at a hotel where there's a hand weaving conference and you're not part of that. It's kind of appalling to watch what goes on in elevators. We're in this because people paw us to, they want to know about the garment we're wearing. Anyway, so I found a very ready audience of people who had experience and now wanted to link that from years ago to what they currently make. And that is, that was the best. When I would teach at craft centers, which typically had almost a younger following, a lot of them on scholarship, I'd have a lot of maybe 20 somethings. And although they claim to sew, and I mean, I say this respectfully, a lot of the people who are trained in sewing now kind of have started out by recycling and repurposing stuff. There's a lot of stuff on the internet. You can take this thing that you just bought, you can turn it into something you can smashingly wear tonight. And so the skill set is different than what I was trained in. And so I remember this one student clearly when I was teaching at this one craft center, and I started talking about the critical aspect of grain line, especially with a hand woven fabric. And you could just see her getting me this blank expression. And she said to me later, I'm sorry, what's a grain line? And she had introduced herself as somebody who really loved to sew, but her skill set was repurposing things that were already cut on grain and just making them fit her and updating them. So there was a lot of stuff for the younger group that I had to fill in the blanks. And I did that. I was thrilled, couple of people, younger people who were very ambitious, took a couple classes with me and then blew the market apart. They were just incredible how they ran with it. There's an energy in the youth. They're undaunted, like I was. I didn't know 90% of what I know now. And yet I plowed forth because, I didn't know that I didn't know.
Exactly. So I'm curious, when you get someone who, let's say, has been hand weaving dish towels or home deck fabric, and they want to start sewing garments, is there a transition period? You're laughing.
Oh my God, what a perfect question. As a matter of fact, I just am polishing off, I just sent off an article for a new hand weaving magazine kind of on this subject. With home textiles, especially dish towels, okay, they're typically woven of cotton, maybe some linen in there, but typically cotton, and cotton will bloom and fill up the spaces, and it gets washed over and over and dried over and over. And so you have a fairly stable cloth, and you're not cutting into it, you're drying dishes. When you switch to yardage for garments, it's a very different set of parameters. And I have been teaching this a lot. My favorite thing to say to students, and I'll explain what this means in a minute, but typically I would look at fabric they'd bring and I'd say, it should have been set denser. And that is SETT, that's with two T's. And the set refers to how dense the yarns are put together. So for example, a set, SETT, of say 20 EPI or ends per inch means there's 20 warp threads in 1 inch. It is not unlike in a knitting, when you're doing a gauge check with your needles, you got to come in at a certain amount of stitches in order to be able to have the pattern work for what you're doing. So it's like that in weaving is because you want a certain density that will be still fluid and drapable, if that's a goal, because mostly I make outerwear, which needs to be really stable and dense and warm. But it also needs to be sturdy enough to support construction details, because unlike the bog jacket, you are going to cut into it. And it is one of the biggest transitions that I think people have to get used to. Being able to set it closer than you would think, and especially if you use structures other than plain weave, which plain weave is basically over, under, over, under, over, under, kind of like we used to do on a piece of cardboard as a kid. That single interlacement of over and under, where both the warp and the weft have equal voice. There's lots of variations on that, and there's also things like twill structures. So if your readers are not driving a car and they look down at their denim jeans that they're wearing and they look really carefully, most likely they will see a slight diagonal line, and that is called a twill structure. It's used a lot in sportswear and denim jeans. It's a sturdier structure, because the interlacement is typically in a 2/2 twill. You've got one weft yarn passing over 2 warps, under 2 warps. So they kind of hug together as one. So it's more fluid because you have fewer interlacements, but it's a little sturdier because you're kind of doubling up on your warps. And so that actually needs to be set denser than a plain weave. So the only way to really learn this, because I was asked to do this article on this subject and 1,500 words, and I'm like, 1,500 words, yeah. This is this is going to be a crash course, but the only way to really, really know is to just do it and try it and wash it and then wear it and wash it again and wear it again. And it's not unlike, when you knit a sweater. I mean, you really don't know until you've worn it a number of times how that yarn, how that how it's all going to work in the long term. And one of the advantages I have is because I did production work in the 80s, and I have seen over the years, some of it I've worn, some of it has come back to me with people who have retired and don't wear that piece anymore, and they don't want to give it away. So it comes back to me, which is hilarious. But I've seen how pieces wear over years. And it's still not unusual for me to say, even about my own piece, I should have set this denser. So, I think the fear is that you set it so dense, you're going to have a cardboard shirt. Trust me, you won't. Because we make clothing out of animal skins. We make it out of boiled wool. We put foundations, 16 layers of foundation in a tailored garment, and it still has drape. It still does what it's supposed to do. But you need to be able to support the fabric when you cut into it. And that's a whole different discussion. So when all of my teaching stopped abruptly during COVID, my daughter happened to be living at home. It was a total coincidence. She was back in school for a vet tech degree, and I hired her to learn how to use Adobe Premiere, to use Adobe Illustrator. She converted all of my patterns I used in classes to digitals, which could then be downloaded. And then we found out that the hand weaving community kind of wasn't tech savvy enough to know what to do with a digital download. So in the middle of COVID, where you couldn't buy a Logitech webcam for 300 miles, I called a local store, high-end camera store, and said, okay, so here's the situation. If we mask up and are completely, hermetically sealed, could we hire a consultant there that will sell us whatever we need to produce a video? And so it was amazing. They were great, and we stood across the room from each other, but I was able to get all the equipment I needed, which I'm still using. And I was able to, we filmed over the course of that next year and a half, every week we filmed a video. We did 80 videos for what is now my YouTube channel. And it's all about sewing with hand-woven fabric. So I went through step by step each of my patterns, all the basics of making those decisions, how to wash it, what to look for, how to handle your cut edges. That's the most watched of all my videos.
Do you recommend that they serge them? I'm curious about what bound edges, serging depends on the fabric.
So okay, so there's a kind of, it depends. The problem with sergers is you have to own one. And you have to have it out of the box and have to know what to do with. You don't want to say to a hand weaver, well, you need this equipment because sewing, you could use an old Kenmore straight stitch and have perfectly gorgeous coutoured garments. Ask me, I did that. I only bought a serger because I was an educator. It is a tool, but here's the difficulty. You need to be able to understand grain line. In hand-woven fabric, probably the most important thing to understand is grain line. Because of the looser construction and the fatter yarns and the nature of it, there is much more obvious grain line than there is in, say, a piece of quilt fabric. They're both woven with a vertical and a horizontal, but it's more obvious and more pliable in a hand-woven fabric. So for the sewers out there, of course, you all know that the warp threads are pretty synonymous with the term we use in sewing called lengthwise grain. You put that line on the pattern on a warp thread instead of parallel to the selvage, because hand-woven fabric, unless you're a really, really fabulous weaver, might be not completely, the selvages might not be completely parallel to a warp thread throughout the entire length of cloth. The weft thread, the cross that's crossed with a shuttle, is synonymous with crosswise grain. So of course, in the perfect world, they are at right angles to each other. The bias, of course, as sewers, we all know what that is. That 45-degree bisection of that right angle is very stretchy, and especially in a hand woven. The thing, and when I wrote a series of articles for Threads magazine, this was one that I had wrote and touched on, and even the editors called me up and they're like, wow, no one has ever explained it this way. Because I make cloth, I get how it's made and what its ramifications are. So any angle cut into that fabric that is not parallel to a warp or weft thread is basically off grain. So if you have a neckline or shoulder that is not parallel to a warp or weft thread, what ends up happening is when you stitch along it, if you stitch in the wrong direction, you're going to add length to it, because those warp threads are not going to want to go under, or weft threads, depending on what direction you're stitching, will not want to go under the pressure of the presser foot easily. So they splay, kind of like, cat paws. And if you were to serge and edge and go against the grain, you're actually going to create a ripple in the edge, and it could be pretty substantial. This even goes with machine stitching. And so attending to direction of grain is one of the most primary things I teach my students. So yes, you can zoom over to the serger, but you must be careful about which way you serge, which direction. Because if you have to go, if you're using it as a seam finish, first of all, never use a serger on a hand-woven fabric as the way the serger was intended, to actually stitch together a seam, overcast, and the whole thing, and cut the seam allowance off. A serger is a commercial way of finishing in one pass an entire garment. You don't want to do that in a hand woven. If you use it as a edge protection or seam finish, you do it on the very edge, because hand woven fabric will kill your serger knives. And then you would sew your normal seam 5/8 of an inch and press it open, so you don't get that lump. But even then, if you're going to do it on the edge, you have to go in the direction of the grain. So that means 50% of that pattern section you're serging upside down. So it's complicated. It is not my drug of choice, shall we say, for seam finishes. And I talk about that at great length in that video. If I'm using it, like I have used it for this one mohair coat that I made, and I didn't want fussy seam finishes. I didn't want fussy anything. So what I did is I serged, and then I just did a hand worked blanket stitch over the edge to kind of cover the serging. Because I raised the sheep, I sheared the wool, I wove the fabric, spun the yarn, wove the fabric. Why would I want to put a commercial seam finish in my garment? So I have, it's a tool in my toolbox, but I use it respectfully. More often than not, there are a couple other options that I much prefer, and I talk about those in the videos. If it's an unlined jacket, of course, a Hong Kong seam finish is gorgeous. And if it's going to be something with a drop lining, serging would be appropriate because it wouldn't be seen. And there's also something I do. I take 15 denier nylon tricot and cut it. I want to say on bias, cut it diagonally. It's not bias in a knit the way we think of as bias in a woven, but there is a give along that diagonal of the knit stitches. And I will cover the edges in that because it's almost transparent, and it saves the edges, it keeps them intact. And the pieces then, could be altered, give or take. And I will use that a lot if the garment's going to be lined, or the garment's going to be not seen inside, like a top. I think the top I have on, I think I did that on the inside because nobody looks, I mean, it's finished, it's beautiful because I was trained that way, but it's not necessary to put Hong Kong seam finishes on something that's overkill. And one of the things you have to avoid as a skilled garment maker when working with hand wovens is to not overkill.
You're talking to
Yeah,
someone who wrote a book on how to finish knitted garments, and
yes.
my knitted garments always looked as nice on the inside as they did on the outside. So I totally get that. I would be one of the people who would have to watch about over finishing my garments made with
Right.
hand woven.
I mean, I have
Yeah.
seen seams. I've judged a lot of fashion shows, as you can imagine, hand-woven fashion shows at conferences, a lot. And I've done a lot of technical critiques of fashion shows. It was kind of a thing that I would do, go to a conference, and then I would give a talk on, oh, look how they finished this seam. Oh, look how they finished this seam. And some of the, right. I mean, I was always as kind as I could be. And the point here is for us to learn. But very commonly, you would have somebody who was so worried about it falling apart that they would overstitch the seam every row of machine stitching. I mean, this is sewing 101. Every row of machine stitching you adds stability. So if like you're doing the stand of a collar that's, in a tailored garment, you do that rainbow stitching in the back of the stand so that collar stands perfectly, but every row of machine stitching to add stability. So the more stitching you add to a seam in a hand woven garment, that seam is going to stand on its own, and the fluid hand woven around it's got this brick wall in the way. So, there's always choices, and the only way to learn is to try over and over and over again.
So I want to talk a little bit about you, and I completely relate to this because traveling got to be too much when I was doing it, and I finally said I just need to stay home. And it sounds like you were able to, during COVID, you were able to morph that teaching experience from in-person teaching to online teaching or teaching through your videos. Are you still, where are you now? It sounds like you have some new interests and you're not retired because
Right.
you don't strike me as the kind of person who's going to actually quote unquote retire.
No, the thing in the arts is you never retire because the arts are about creativity, and they are about finding ways to manifest that. So technically retirement, you would think, you have a 9 to 5 job, you end it one day, they throw you a party, and then you ride off into the sunset and do whatever. If you look, if your viewers could see my picture in the video, I have 40 looms in the studio. I'm down from 64, so we're getting there, but I still have this very intense studio, none of which I really need anymore because I'm not teaching in that way. But I love what I do. And so I'm still weaving, but I'm weaving for curiosity. I'm weaving because it's fun. And I'm getting to do what I want to do without having to worry about, is it going to be exhibited? Is it a sample for this? Is it for a deadline for a magazine? Is it, whatever. But I also wanted to, so when you get to a certain point where you're considered, I don't know, the expert in that area, for what it's worth, I don't want to say that I'm an expert, more is that I'm opinionated. So, but I'm opinionated with years and decades of experience, so that because I say it may not be true for you, but it's got a lot of support data behind it. But I wanted to, at this point in my life, I just turned 70. I wanted to begin to start learning new things and start at the bottom. It's daunting to go from knowing it all to knowing absolutely nothing. I had years ago I wanted a hobby. I wanted a hobby. So I took up playing the recorder. It's a simple instrument to learn. And, over the years, it led to me playing with groups. And I play regularly with a group called Montclair Early Music, which is, in a couple of towns over. And we play all kinds of early stuff from the 1600s, stuff King Henry VIII wrote, who knew? And he had a side job. And so that's been a fun experience for me. And at this point in my life, what's really critical is community, because I don't want to leave my house anymore, but I want to be part of a community. So the community of musicians is amazing. We get together and rehearse every week. We do concerts. I get together with people privately. We go over stuff. We try new music. And I typically play bass recorder for them. And it's very mathematical, as weaving is. I studied piano as a kid. I knew how to read music. So this was all in my wheelhouse. But I'm playing the same bass line as the cello player behind me. And she sounds so cool. And I was like, I want to be her when I grow up. So in September of last year, I bought a cello and I started to take lessons. And I just had my cello recital last weekend. With all the little kids playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and all its variations. It was so much fun. And I'm not very good, but I'm determined, and I'm throwing everything I have at it, as I did with hand weaving. The fact that I'm not very good, I'm undaunted, because you get good at anything by sticking with it. And so that's really important to me. And then through a series of unfortunate or fortunate, depending on your perspective, events, involvement with some garden clubs and things, that just accidentally went to a couple of lectures and realized that my beautiful half-acre of landscaping in my suburban neighborhood was heavily planted by a professional in the 1980s. Every plant on the property started with the word Japanese. And now we know better, or at least some of the country knows better, that those plants are basically destroying the environment. And it was with a lot of sadness that I realized that my property was contributing to that badly. And so I last spring hired a landscape designer, and who came in and loved my upper story, but we decided that she was going to come in, and I ripped out 30 Japanese barberries. The burning bushes, we're still ripping them out. But she put 3,000 native plants, bushes, and trees on my property, which now, this is, so the first year in, I'm looking at what was planted last April, May. Now I'm looking, and it is remarkable. It's remarkable, the difference in the soil, in what's around in my yard, the bugs, the birds. I have frogs in my ponds again. It is beautiful. And New Jersey has an incredibly active native plant society. They had a retreat last September, and I went down to it. It was in Cape May, at their science center, and I would walk around with people, and they'd be pointing to things, and I'd be like, "I have no idea what you're talking about," and and I said, "Look, so I'm really into this. But I'll tell you, I wrote a check. I know nothing, but I am an eager learner. I want to learn as much as I can. I want to start at the bottom, but I don't have enough years left to start at the bottom by going to the local garden center, which, by the way, still sells all those invasive plants. And again, I'm starting at the bottom, but I'm doing it with enthusiasm. So here's the interesting link to those of you who are still hanging on the hand weaving part of it. So now I go in my yard and I look at a plant and I think, well, first of all, who are you? Because the birds are depositing seeds that they have been through their digestive tracts of God knows what. So I'll look at a bush or a tree or like something, a 4-foot thing that wasn't there before. And I go, well, who are you? And were you invited to the party? So I make judicious use of plant apps and determine whether it's something that came from a neighbor's yard that shouldn't be there. In that case, it gets ripped out. But is it something that's important? And then I'll leave it in. And so I will look at a plant, first assess what it is, and then I'll say, well, can I eat you? Can I make a medicine out of you? That's a whole nother field that I'm just starting to investigate. And can I use you for a dye? Can I use you for eco printing or botanical printing, which is very cool? I have got some stuff on this property that are not on anybody's lists of well-known printers, and like Nine Bark, which is makes an incredible print on silk, when bundled, steamed, and hard pressed and rolled. So I'm learning the stuff that I have, can help in all these ways. And I also look and say, can I make cordage out of you? Can I make a basket out of you? Can I weave with you? I wove a whole set of mats for my dining room table out of a very invasive, horrible plant that's all over my yard because the leaves on it are 6 foot tall, flag irises. And I've had friends going, you have to rip them out. And I'm like, I don't want to. I harvest them every year and I can make cordage out of them. And I can, for basketry, and I can make, there's just not enough hours in the day to do all this fun stuff. I'm able to relate all of this, to each other. And, so it's raining today. I have my landscape designer here. She just went to a garden center and found pawpaw trees and sassafras and native green nine barks. And, it's just like, and she's out there like planting. And so I will be changing my clothes and getting very dirty this afternoon. But when days it rains, I'm in here, in my studio, and I'm taking natural online. Thank God for online classes, natural dye classes from Maywa in Canada. And, there's just so much to learn. And I don't want to abandon what I did, but I've left a digital legacy so that people can carry on without me. And I can go quietly into the, well, not quietly, I'm like riding a team of horses, but into the sunset and not have to keep doing what I was doing. And a matter of fact, this is very sweet, a little sidebar. So I recently attended a gala fundraiser for an estate gardens in Short Hills, New Jersey, called Greenwood Gardens. And I'm a supporter of them. And I donated one of my handwoven scarves to their silent auction, and they were thrilled. And at the gala, I happened to run into someone, sort of a momentary blank, like, I know you, but like we're out of context, from one of my neighboring guilds, weaving guilds. And she said, I just wanted you to know that we have formed a study group and we're all making one of your patterns and we're all watching your videos together. And we're going to do this. And I was so thrilled when I hear that guilds and groups can gather and help themselves, because all the information is there. You don't need me. And I know people still go, well, can't you come? And no, I mean, a lot of my ability to teach has been diluted. I don't have the samples. I don't have the ability I am not getting on a plane to teach ever again. Yeah, it's exciting, Good luck
What a
editing this.
legacy to look back on.
It is. It is. And I'm really grateful for the things that were planted along the way that allowed me the journey, the support I had, the people who mentored me in life. Um, you know, that I'm in a position where I can explore these new things and I don't have to keep pounding the pavement on the road. I will teach online, I mean it's easy to turn on a Zoom camera to give a lecture with uh, content that I've already developed, but I'm not developing new content. I don't need to. I've said it all. I've written more than 100 articles. It's all there.
If our listeners want to find out more about you, you have a website.
I have a website. I have an e-shop, and where you can buy the patterns. And there's, if you're a hand weaver, there are drafts, some of my more interesting fabrics that I have available. They're $2.99 downloads. And I also have a blog. So I started a blog back when that was like a thing to do, back in 2008. And I started it because I did like to journal, but I also love visuals. And so to be able to put pictures with what I was talking about made sense to me. So my husband set me up with a WordPress account and figured out how, I figured out how to use it. And I started blogging, and I've probably close to 1,000 blog posts at this point. And I blog about every couple of weeks. And it's really about my journey as a creative person. And at this point, gardening has come into it and some music has come into it. But I'm still a hand weaver, and I still make clothing, as much as I need. I mean, part of the thing is I don't need clothing anymore. I don't go anywhere. And actually, I'm working with a museum, of hand weaving museum in Clayton, New York, is interested in taking a lot of the collection. So it will be available for people to go and look at, and with all the documentation, because I don't need it. I don't, especially the exhibition pieces. Where am I going to wear that? And so it is. So now when I do so, it's because I'm making medieval costumes for a Renaissance festival that we're playing in, which is a whole other thing. Oh, and I should say this. So I didn't want to stop sewing, but I don't need to sew. So what I do is I volunteer as a stitcher with the local professional Shakespeare theater in New Jersey. I can alter anything. And they love me because I'm free and I'm knowledgeable and I'm undaunted by whatever it is they hand me to do. And sometimes I'll look at them and go, "You want me to do what?" I'm like, "Okay." And I'll figure it out. But it is so much fun to work on stuff that I would never have come across my radar, in the real world. And so once a week I go down to the costume shop and do whatever it is they need me to do. And it's a great way to bring skills that I have but no longer need for me personally to a place that is desperate for skilled people, So that's something that is important to me, and supporting the arts wherever I can, in whatever way I can, whether I weave hand woven scarves and give them to their galas to auction off. I mean, it's like I do what I can.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up here. And
Right.
I will put links to your blog and to your YouTube channel. And I want
And
to
my
take a look
website.
at your patterns because I don't weave, but I do have some hand woven fabric. And
Well,
so,
and even, they'll work for any fabric.
oh, sure.
But the interesting thing is that the directions are extensive. They were actually edited by Anne Marie Soto, who was very, very active she was the publisher or the editor for the publication that came out of the American Sewing Guild. And she passed away a year or so ago. And we were, because she was part of our local chapter, and we were devastated. But Anne Marie edited every one of my handouts, and each one of them will have a step, how to do this technique, but then it will have the link for the accompanying video to show you how. So the directions are really thorough. So if you're new at sewing and you want to make a basic jacket, even out of commercial fabric, it's a really good hand holder to help you get through this. So
Awesome.
yeah.
Yeah, I will definitely put links to all of that. But this has been a great discussion. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
It's been a pleasure.
I so enjoy interviewing these dynamic makers, and I wish that we weren't separated by such distance sometimes, because I think a lot of these people that I've interviewed could be very close friends of mine, and we would have a lot of fun together. My best sewing buddy, Tara, who is always up for a road trip to someplace interesting having to do with sewing, Tara and her husband have accepted a 3-year mission term in Mexico, and they're leaving this week. So I'm going to be without a sewing buddy now. I'm going to have to find somebody else that's willing to travel with me and do fun things. I know this has been one of the longer episodes I've produced, so I will just wrap it up here by saying feedback is always welcome. I enjoy reading the reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you want to leave a review there, I would greatly appreciate it. It does help other people find us. If you want to look at the show notes, they are at the website for the podcast, which is www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. My website is www.janetzabo.com, and that has links to the Big Sky Knitting Designs website where you can buy my patterns and books, as well as my blog. I also have a blog, just like Daryl, and I also have pictures of what I'm working on and sometimes photos of wildlife or food from the garden. So if that's interesting to you, follow the link from the janetzabo.com website. And until the next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.